I'll give you gold if you can explain this contract." The words came out of Richard Sterling's mouth like a malicious joke, followed by a laugh that echoed through the marble lobby of Sterling International Trading in the heart of Manhattan. But Sarah Martinez, 28 years old, who had been greeting visitors at that reception desk every day for 2 years, just looked up politely and continued organizing her agenda papers. The document Richard was waving in the air, a 200-page import contract, fluttered like a battle flag against her dignity. "Hey everyone, look at this." Richard turned to the 4 directors who had just come out of the 10 o'clock meeting. His eyes gleamed with that casual cruelty of the powerful. Sarah here must be curious about these complex legal clauses. The directors laughed softly, that embarrassed laugh of those who don't want to contradict the boss. Richard was known for his moments of brilliance, bursts of arrogance that he considered intelligent leadership demonstrations. Sarah continued her methodical work. Every phone call answered professionally, every visitor received courteously, every document organized with the same care she had maintained for 2 years. At 28, she had learned that the best defense against humiliation was maintaining professional dignity. "Seriously, Sarah," Richard raised his tone, making sure everyone in the lobby paid attention. "You who work at reception must look at this and see hieroglyphics, right? The document was an import contract for industrial equipment from Germany, 200 pages of technical terms, complex customs clauses, refined international legal language. Richard had received it yesterday and spent the night trying to understand the main points." Sarah stopped typing for a moment. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard. Deep in her chest, something stirred. It wasn't anger, it was something more dangerous. It was knowledge wanting to escape. "Mr. Sterling," said Jennifer, the administrative director, trying to change the subject, "about the meeting with the Germans." "No, no," Richard raised his hand. "I want Sarah to see this. Come here, Sarah." She got up slowly, as she always did when requested. Richard held the document high, out of her reach, as if it were an unattainable prize. "Look how interesting. It says here, let me see." He pretended to read with difficulty. "FOB Hamburg Incoterms Clause." "Oh my God, how complicated. Do you have any idea what this means, Sarah?" Sarah looked at the floor. "No, Mr. Sterling, of course not." He clapped his hands. "Imagine a receptionist understanding foreign trade terms." The directors shifted uncomfortably. Robert, the oldest on the team, avoided looking directly at the scene. Richard was warming up. He was a 52-year-old man who had inherited the company from his father and expanded it to the international market. His greatest pleasure was demonstrating intellectual superiority, especially over those he considered basic employees. "You know what's funny, guys?" he continued, now completely immersed in his arrogance show. "These people sit at reception all day, watching important documents pass by, and think they understand something about our business." Sarah took a deep breath. 2 years working there, 2 years being treated like decoration, 2 years watching contracts pass through her desk and pretending not to understand anything. But something about that day was different. Maybe it was the humiliation being done in front of so many people, or maybe it was simply the limit. "Excuse me, Mr. Sterling," she said, with a low but firm voice. "Could I take a look at the contract?" The silence that followed was deafening. Richard blinked, confused. In 2 years, Sarah had never spoken up about company matters, had never questioned anything, had never even shown interest in documents that weren't reception-related. "You want to see?" He almost stuttered. "What for?" "Just professional curiosity, sir." The directors exchanged glances. What the hell was happening with the receptionist? Richard felt like the script of his private play had been interrupted. For a moment, he didn't know how to react. Then, his wounded ego reacted with even more cruelty. "Professional curiosity," he laughed, but now there was a forced note in the laughter. "Did you hear that? Sarah wants to have professional curiosity about a $2 million contract." He held the document even higher, as if it were a trophy. "You know what, Sarah? You just gave me a fantastic idea to brighten our morning." Richard walked to the leather sofa in the lobby, that Italian set that cost more than Sarah's annual salary. His eyes gleamed with an idea he considered brilliant. "Guys, you're going to love this." He patted the sofa arm. "We're going to have an educational demonstration here." Sarah remained standing by the reception with her hands professionally crossed. Something in the air had changed. She could feel it. It was like a storm was forming, and she was right in the center. "Jennifer," Richard turned to the administrative director, "you have an MBA in international trade, right? 3 years studying international contracts?" "Yes, Richard, but..." "And you, Robert?" He pointed to the commercial director. "How many years do you have of import experience? 20? 25? Robert adjusted his tie nervously. "Richard, where are you going with this? It's obvious." Richard got up, dramatizing every movement. "We have highly specialized people here with expensive education who studied foreign trade their whole lives. And we have Sarah who answers phones." Michael, the youngest director, whispered to Jennifer, "This is getting uncomfortable." But Richard was far from finished. He had found his stage and captive audience. "The qualification difference here is gigantic, people. Think with me. I pay $8,000 a month to Jennifer because she understands contracts. I pay $10,000 to Robert because he masters imports. And I pay $3,000 to Sarah because she receives visitors politely." He paused for effect, observing the uncomfortable expressions around. "But Sarah here wants to have professional curiosity about an import contract, which is exactly the type of document that you, with all this qualification, sometimes take days to analyze completely." Sarah continued in silence, but her eyes didn't leave the document in Richard's hands. There was something in those pages she recognized, not just the technical terms, but the structure, the format, even some specific clauses she had seen before. "You know what I'm going to do?" Richard had his great inspiration. "I'm going to turn this into a practical lesson for all of us." He walked to the panoramic window, overlooking New York Harbor. Down there, cargo ships came and went, loaded with dreams and merchandise from around the world. "Look down there," he said, with the air of someone about to reveal a profound truth. "Each person has their function in the business world, right? I direct strategy. You execute complex operations. Sarah receives people at the door." Jennifer tried to interrupt again. "Richard, maybe it would be better to return to..." "No!" He hit his fist on the glass. "This is business education. This is more valuable than any meeting we had scheduled." He returned to Sarah, who remained motionless by reception. "Sarah, do you really want to see this import contract?" "If you don't mind, sir, you know what I'm going to do." Richard's smile was pure, calculated malice. "I'm going to show you this contract. I'm going to let you try to explain it. And when you fail, because it's mathematical that you'll fail, I want everyone here to learn an important lesson about competence and hierarchy." Michael whispered to Robert, "Someone should stop this circus." Robert whispered back, "You know Richard. When he gets into an idea, it's better to let him tire himself out." Richard dragged an armchair to the center of the lobby, as if setting up a tribunal. "Sit here, Sarah. Today you're going to be a director for a few minutes." Sarah hesitated. In 2 years working there, she had never participated in executive meetings, had never even given opinions on company matters, except to relay messages. "Come on, sit," Richard insisted. "Today you'll have the chance to show this professional curiosity." She sat slowly, maintaining her upright, professional posture. Her fingers interlaced in her lap, not from nervousness, but from an emotion she couldn't quite name. It was as if a door that had been closed for years was about to open. "Perfect!" Richard clapped his hands. "Now we have our volunteer student." He held the contract, as if it were a lethal weapon. "Get ready, Sarah. You're about to discover the difference between working at reception and really understanding how a company works." The intercom at reception rang at the exact moment Richard was going to start his practical class. The voice of the secretary from the upper floor sounded tense. "Mr. Sterling, Mr. Klaus from Bergman Industries is on the line. Says it's extremely urgent about the contract." Richard immediately paled. Klaus Hoffmann wasn't just any client. He was the general director of Bergman Industries, the German giant of industrial equipment that represented 40% of Sterling International Trading's revenue. "Put him through," Richard said, trying to keep his voice steady while taking the reception phone. "Richard, mein Freund." Klaus's voice came out loud from the speaker with a heavy German accent. "We have a serious problem with the contract we sent yesterday." "Problem?" Richard tried to sound calm. "What kind of problem, Klaus?" "Our legal team discovered 3 serious errors in the version we sent, clauses that can invalidate the entire agreement if not corrected." Sweat began to form on Richard's forehead. What kind of errors? First, the Incoterms clause has reversed responsibilities. Second, payment terms conflict with Brazilian legislation. Third, there's a serious problem in the force majeure clause that could cost us millions in case of delay. Richard looked desperately at his directors. Jennifer frowned. Robert shook his head. Michael looked confused. "Klaus, I can analyze this and get back to you." "There's no time, Richard," Klaus interrupted him. "Our board meets today at 5 in the afternoon, German time. It's 11 in the morning here in Brazil. We only have 3 hours to resolve this or the project is cancelled." "Cancelled?" Richard felt the ground disappear. "Klaus, this contract is worth 2 million euros? "Exactly. And if we can't correct the errors in time, we'll have to activate Plan B with our Argentine supplier." Richard looked at the clock. 11:15 a.m. 3 hours to decipher complex legal problems in a 200-page contract or lose the biggest deal of the year. "Klaus, explain to me exactly where these problems are." "Sure. First problem, page 47, clause 12.3, about FOB Incoterms. It says you assume risks only until the port of New York, but it should be until Hamburg." Richard frantically flipped to page 47. The English words mixed together in front of him. FOB, CIF, DAP. They were all terms he knew superficially, but had never completely mastered. "Klaus, can you repeat that slower?" Second problem, page 73, payment section. You put a 60-day term, but American legislation for capital goods imports requires bank confirmation within 30 days. Page 73. Richard found the section, but the legal language was too dense for quick analysis. He would need hours to fully understand the implications. And the third problem, page 156, force majeure clause. It's too broad, includes strikes and port problems. If there's any delay in delivery, you can cancel without penalty, but we're stuck with the agreement. Richard was officially in panic. 3 complex technical problems, each in different sections of the contract, each requiring specialized knowledge he didn't have. "Klaus, I need to consult my legal team." "What legal team?" "Richard, you don't have an internal legal department. You've always used outsourced firms." The cruel but true observation silenced Richard. Sterling International Trading had grown rapidly, but had never invested in internal legal expertise. "I can hire an urgent specialist." "In 3 hours?" "Richard, this isn't simple translation. These are complex issues of international commercial law. You need someone who really understands import contracts." The call was disconnected. The lobby fell into mortal silence. Richard looked at his directors like a castaway looking for a life preserver. "Jennifer, can you analyze these clauses?" Jennifer quickly flipped through the contract. "Richard, my MBA was more focused on management. These specific legal issues are beyond what I can safely evaluate." "Robert!" Robert shook his head. "I have operational experience, but I never dealt with the legal part of contracts. I always left that to lawyers." "Michael." "Richard, I'm trained in administration. International law isn't my area." Richard sat heavily in the armchair he had prepared to humiliate Sarah. The irony was cruel. He had set up a scenario to demonstrate intellectual superiority, and now discovered that neither he nor his qualified team could solve a problem that could cost 2 million euros. 3 hours, he murmured, looking at the contract as if it were a death sentence. 3 hours to save the biggest deal of the year. It was at this moment of absolute desperation that his eyes met Sarah's, still sitting in the armchair in the center of the lobby, silently observing the drama unfold. And a completely desperate idea began to form in Richard Sterling's mind, an idea he would never consider under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. Someone has to know a specialist lawyer. Richard was on the verge of desperation. "Jennifer, don't you have contacts from when you did your MBA?" "Richard, I already called 3 firms. One is in court all day, another charges $15,000 for urgent analysis, and the third only has availability tomorrow." "15,000? Richard stopped walking. "To analyze a contract?" "It's the price of urgency and specialization," Robert explained. "International commercial law isn't a common area." Richard took a deep breath. $15,000 was a lot of money, but compared to the 2 million euros at stake, it was a necessary investment. "Okay, let's hire the 15,001, Jennifer called back. The conversation lasted 5 minutes. When she hung up, her expression was grim. "And?" Richard asked anxiously. "He can start the analysis this afternoon and deliver an opinion tomorrow morning." "Tomorrow?" Richard exploded. "I need the answer in 2.5 hours. He said it's impossible. 200 pages of international contract, 3 specific legal problems. You can't work miracles." Richard sat at Sarah's reception desk, putting his head in his hands. For the first time in 20 years running the company, he felt completely powerless. Michael tried an alternative. "What if we called other German clients? Maybe someone has faced similar problems." "Michael," Robert cut him off, "are you going to call competitors asking for help not to lose a client?" "It was just an idea. Let's try to analyze ourselves," Richard decided, desperate. "It's better to try than do nothing." The next 30 minutes were a disaster. They pored over the contract, trying to decipher the legal implications of each problematic clause. The result was catastrophic. "FOB Hamburg Incoterms," Jennifer read aloud. "This means that they assume the risk until Hamburg?" "No, I think it means that we assume," Robert disagreed. "FOB is free on board, so—" "But Klaus said it was wrong," Michael intervened. "So maybe it's the opposite." Richard interrupted them. "You're guessing. We can't bet 2 million euros on assumptions." The second clause was even worse. The terms about American legislation required specific knowledge that none of them possessed. The third, about force majeure, was so technical they couldn't even fully understand what was written. "This doesn't work," Jennifer finally admitted. "We're flying blind." Richard looked at the clock. 12:30 p.m. 2.5 hours until the deadline. Every minute that passed was like a needle to the chest. Robert suggested, "What if you called Klaus and explained that you need more time, asked for an extension until tomorrow?" "Robert, for God's sake!" Richard exploded. The guy just said he has an Argentine supplier on standby. If I ask for an extension, he'll think we're incompetent." He was right. In international business, asking for more time to solve basic problems is a sign of weakness. German clients especially value efficiency and competence. What if... Michael hesitated. What if we tried to respond based on what we understood and hoped for the best? Michael, do you want me to bet 2 million euros on hoping for the best? Richard was almost shouting. Jennifer tried to calm. Richard, maybe we can... We can what? Richard interrupted her. Work magic? Become international law specialists in 2 hours? The desperation was palpable. Richard had built a solid company, but always depending on third parties for specific technical areas. And now, when he needed it most, there was no third party available. 20 years building this company, he murmured, pacing back and forth. 20 years. And it's all going down the drain because we can't understand 3 contractual clauses. Michael observed. Richard, this isn't your fault. International commercial law is a very specific area. It is my fault, Richard exploded. It's my fault for building an import company without having internal legal expertise, for always outsourcing everything. He looked again at the damned document, 200 pages that could represent his salvation or his ruin. And he was as lost as an illiterate person trying to read a medical book. 2.5 hours, he whispered, looking at the phone where he would have to call Klaus. 2.5 hours to admit I'm incompetent. It was at this moment of total defeat that his eyes found Sarah for the 4th time. She was still there, sitting in the armchair, respectfully watching the executive collapse unfold. And an absolutely insane idea began to grow in Richard's head. Richard stopped abruptly in the middle of the lobby. All eyes turned to him when they realized something had changed in his posture. It was like a light bulb had turned on, not from genuine hope, but from a perversely desperate idea. "Wait," he said slowly, a bizarre smile beginning to form. "Wait." He walked to Sarah, who was still sitting in the armchair, watching everything with her. Attentive eyes. The contract was there on the coffee table next to her, like a bomb about to explode. "Sarah," Richard said, and there was something different in his voice, something that made all the directors straighten in their chairs. "Do you still want to take a look at this contract?" Sarah looked at him calmly. "If you allow it, sir." Richard laughed, but it was a laugh without joy. It was the laugh of a man who had found a cruel way to transform his professional failure into the final entertainment of the morning. "You know what, guys?" He turned to the team. "I think I found the perfect solution to our crisis." "How so?" Jennifer asked, suspicious. "It's brilliant." Richard clapped his hands as if he had discovered the cure for cancer. "If we don't have a specialist lawyer available, let's use our internal consultant." He pointed to Sarah with a theatrical gesture. The silence that followed was deep enough to hear a pin drop. "Richard," Robert began with a cautious voice. "You can't be serious." "Serious?" Richard laughed louder. "Robert, don't you understand yet? This is the perfect opportunity. Let's find out once and for all if Sarah really has this professional curiosity she demonstrated." Jennifer whispered to Michael, "He's completely lost it." But Richard was completely immersed in his desperate fantasy. He had found a way to transform his business humiliation into someone else's humiliation, and the psychological relief was too irresistible to resist. "Look, Sarah," he said, approaching her with the contract in his hands. "You want so much to understand this document. Then I'm going to give you the chance of your life." He paused dramatically, savoring the moment like an actor on stage. "If you can explain these 3 problematic clauses perfectly, identify the errors Klaus mentioned, and suggest the correct corrections. He made another pause, looking at everyone present. I'll give you my gold collection. The impact of the words was like an explosion. Jennifer choked on her coffee. Robert dropped his glasses. Michael's mouth fell open. Richard! Jennifer stood up abruptly. You can't bet your gold collection. Why not? Richard was euphoric now, fueled by the adrenaline of the absurd situation he had created. If she's as smart as she thinks she is, if she really understands contracts, then she deserves a collection worth $200,000, right? The gold collection was Richard's pride. Rare American coins and bars stored in a private vault, which he used to impress clients and as a hedge against inflation. He turned to Sarah, who watched him with a serene and indecipherable expression. And you know why I can make this bet calmly, Sarah? Richard smiled with calculated cruelty. Because it's impossible for a receptionist who makes $3,000, who never went to law school, who never had access to specialized training, to analyze an international commercial contract. Robert tried to intervene. Richard, you're exaggerating. Exaggerating. Richard turned to him. Robert, you yourself said you can't analyze. Jennifer, with an MBA, said it's beyond her reach. And I'm going to give Sarah the chance to prove she's more competent than all of us together. He returned to Sarah, who remained motionless in the armchair. But there's a condition, Sarah. If you fail, and you will fail, you lose your job. Today. No notice, nothing. Because then I'll prove to everyone here that there is a difference between those who studied and those who didn't. The silence was deafening. Jennifer had her hands covering her face. Robert was shaking his head negatively. Michael looked at Richard as if he didn't recognize him. And one more thing, Richard continued, completely absorbed in his cruel performance. If you accept this bet and fail, I want you to admit, in front of everyone, that a receptionist will never understand what qualified people do. Sarah finally spoke, with a low but firm voice. And if I succeed? The question caught Richard off guard. For a moment, he was speechless. The possibility that she might actually succeed was so remote that he hadn't even seriously considered it. If you succeed, he stuttered, then recovered his arrogance. If you succeed, which obviously won't happen, I'll keep my word. The gold collection is yours. He laughed, shaking his head condescendingly. But that's pure fantasy, Sarah, because it won't happen. You're more likely to become an astronaut than to correctly decipher this contract. Sarah slowly got up from the armchair. For the first time in 2 years, she looked directly into Richard's eyes, without lowering her gaze, without looking away, without showing submission. I accept, she said. The 2 words fell in the lobby like a nuclear bomb. Richard blinked several times, as if he hadn't heard correctly. You accept? I accept the bet, Mr. Sterling. Robert immediately stood up. Sarah, you don't need to do this. This is gratuitous humiliation. With due respect, Mr. Robert, Sarah said, still staring at Richard, each person knows their own limitations and their own capabilities. Richard felt a strange shiver go up his spine. There was something in Sarah's tone, in the way she looked at him, in the quiet confidence of her posture, that didn't match the submissive image he had of her. Are you absolutely sure about this? He asked, and for the first time there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. I'm sure. Jennifer tried one last intervention. Sarah, it's only 2 hours. Even experienced lawyers would need more time. 2 hours are enough, Sarah replied calmly, for someone who knows what they're looking for. The answer made Richard frown. There was something strangely specific about that statement. So, Richard swallowed hard. beginning to realize he might have gotten himself into a more complex situation than he imagined. So, let's begin. You have 2 hours to analyze 200 pages, identify 3 specific problems, and suggest corrections that satisfy German and American legislation simultaneously. Sarah nodded silently and extended her hand. "Can I see the document now?" Richard hesitated for a moment. Suddenly, something about the situation didn't seem as funny as it had moments before. But it was. Too late to back down. Half the office had already stopped to watch the spectacle. He placed the heavy contract in Sarah's hands. "Your 2 hours start now." Sarah opened the document to the first page, and something extraordinary happened. Her eyes didn't scan the text like someone trying to decipher a foreign language. They moved with the precision and speed of someone who was reading. "Industrial equipment supply contract," she murmured. "Governed by the Vienna Convention on International Sale of Goods." Richard felt the first thread of real worry cross his mind. Sarah held the document with both hands, her fingers going through the pages with a familiarity that immediately caught everyone's attention. She wasn't looking at the contract like someone trying to decipher hieroglyphics. She was reading like someone who recognized every term, every structure, every format. "This is a standard CIF import contract," she said with a clear and technical voice. "Based on Incoterms 2020, with specific clauses for high-technology equipment under German export control." Richard blinked several times. You read that?" Sarah quickly turned some pages, her eyes scanning the sections with professional efficiency. "The total value is €2,300,000, divided into 3 partial deliveries, with financing through letter of credit confirmed by German bank." "Wait." Robert approached. "How do you know this so fast?" Sarah continued her analysis as if she hadn't heard the question. "The first delivery is scheduled for March, production line equipment. Second delivery in June, automated control systems. Third delivery in September, replacement parts and technical training." "Stop!" Richard shouted, standing up abruptly. "Stop this right now!" But Sarah continued, impassive. "The problem Mr. Klaus mentioned in Clause 12.3 is real. It's defined as Phoebe Hamburg, but it should be CF New York. The responsibility for insurance and freight is inverted." "How do you know what Klaus said?" Richard was pale. "He spoke in German." "He spoke in English, Mr. Sterling, and he specifically mentioned 3 problems: inverted Incoterms, conflict in payment terms, and force majeure clause too broad." Jennifer quickly checked her notes. "She's right. Those were exactly the points he mentioned." Richard felt like the world was spinning off its axis. "This doesn't make sense. It makes no sense." "It all." Sarah turned to page 73. "The second problem is here. Payment term of 60 days, but Federal Reserve regulation requires confirmation within 30 days for imports over $1 million. "Regulation of what?" Michael asked, confused. "Federal Reserve. Foreign exchange regulation for foreign trade operations," Sarah responded automatically, as if it were the most basic knowledge in the world. Robert took his laptop and started searching quickly. 2 minutes later, he looked up, mouth agape. "She's right. The Federal Reserve regulation really establishes this." Richard began pacing back and forth like a caged animal. "No, no, no, this can't be happening. You're making this up. You memorized this from somewhere." Sarah stopped reading and looked directly at him. "Mr. Sterling, in 2 years working here, have you ever seen me studying contracts? Ever seen me with legal material?" The question was simple, but cut like a blade. Richard knew the answer. Sarah had always been the model of professional discretion. She arrived on time, did her work, left, never got involved with matters that weren't reception-related. "But then how?" he stuttered. Sarah returned to the document. The third problem is on page 156, clause 18.4 about force majeure. It includes strikes, port stoppages, and acts of God. This allows unilateral cancellation without penalty in situations that are normal in the US. Jennifer checked quickly. Page 156. Here. It is. Section 18.4. Exactly as she said. This means that, Sarah continued, in case of any port strike, and which happens regularly in New York, you can cancel the contract without paying a fine, but leave Bergman with equipment stuck in Germany. Richard stopped walking. And what would be the solution? Restrict the clause only to extraordinary events. War, natural disasters, pandemics, normal labor events cannot be considered force majeure. Robert was typing frantically on the laptop. Richard, she's making more sense than any analysis I've ever seen. Richard looked at his directors. All had the same expression of shock and confusion. It was like the receptionist had transformed into a specialized legal consultant in front of their eyes. "Who are you?" he asked, with his voice almost whispering. Sarah carefully organized the pages she had analyzed. "I'm Sarah Martinez, Mr. Sterling. I work at your company's reception for 2 years." "No," Richard shook his head. "No, that's not an answer. How do you know all this?" Sarah took a deep breath. For the first time since they knew her, she smiled. It wasn't a submissive or embarrassed smile. It was the smile of someone who was about to reveal a secret kept for a long time. "Do you really want to know, sir?" "I demand to know," Jennifer whispered. "Sarah, you don't need to explain anything to him." "No, Jennifer. It's time." Sarah leaned back in the armchair, still holding the contract. "Mr. Sterling, you talked about hierarchy, about qualification, about knowing our place in the world." She paused, looking directly into his eyes. "Maybe it's time for you to discover what my real place is." The silence that followed was loaded with expectation. Richard, Jennifer, Robert, and Michael waited, knowing they were about to hear something that would completely change their understanding of who Sarah Martinez was. "My full name," she began, "is Sarah Martinez Delgado. I graduated in law from Columbia University, with specialization in international trade from Harvard Business School. I have a master's degree in international law from New York University." Richard's world collapsed. The silence that followed Sarah's revelation was so profound, it seemed to suck all the oxygen from the lobby. "You... what?" Jennifer was the first to manage to articulate words. "For 8 years, I worked at the law firm Morrison, Martinez and Associates as a partner, specialized in foreign trade law. I was responsible for import and export contracts involving more than $50 million. Richard let himself fall into the nearest chair. "This can't be true," Sarah continued with a serene and professional voice. "I speak fluent English, basic German, and I'm certified in American and European customs legislation. I spent 6 months in Hamburg studying port contracts and European Union regulation." "But then," Robert stuttered, "how did you end up here, working at reception?" Sarah looked out the window for a moment, as if deciding how much of her story to tell. 3 years ago, my mother was diagnosed with cancer. She lived alone in Phoenix, had no one else. I was an only child." Her voice maintained the professional tone, but something in her eyes softened. "The firm where I worked had no patience with my constant trips to accompany her treatment. They said I was losing professional focus, that I could no longer deliver consistent results." Michael whispered, "They fired you because of that?" "They fired me on a Friday, the eve of Mother's Day 2021. 8 years of dedication, hundreds of successful contracts, dozens of satisfied clients. None of that mattered when I needed to be human instead of just professional." Richard swallowed hard. Suddenly, all his jokes about knowing our place in life sounded cruelly ironic. I stayed 8 months taking care of my mother full-time, Sarah continued. Treatment, chemotherapy, radiotherapy, surgeries. When she died, I had lost all professional contacts and had been out of work for almost a year. And then you, Jennifer couldn't finish. Then I realized that pride doesn't pay funeral bills, nor the debts that accumulated during treatment. I started looking for work in the legal area, but 26-year-old lawyers who were out of the market for a year are seen as problematic. Robert closed the laptop, completely absorbed in the story, especially young women who abandoned clients for family issues, Sarah added with a bitter smile. The legal market doesn't forgive career interruptions, even for noble reasons. But why didn't you say anything when you were hired here? Richard asked. Say what? That I used to be a lawyer? Would that change anything? Would you hire me as a receptionist knowing my background? Richard knew the answer. Of course not. No company hires someone overqualified for basic functions, for fear that the person will leave at the first better opportunity. Now, for 2 years, Sarah continued, I woke up every day at 6 in the morning, took 2 subways to get here, received visitors politely, organized schedules, and went home. But you stayed by choice? Jennifer asked. I stayed because I needed to work, and because gradually I began to enjoy the simplicity. 2 years without extreme pressure, without office internal politics, without having to prove competence every day to men who earn 3 times more, doing half the work. The last observation made Richard blush. Besides, Sarah smiled, working invisible, you hear interesting things. Michael's eyes widened. You heard our work conversations? For 2 years, you discussed contracts, legal problems, import difficulties, customs issues, everything in front of me, as if I were part of the furniture. I learned more about this company than many long-time employees. Richard blushed even more intensely. What else did you hear? I heard you complaining that you couldn't find competent lawyers in foreign trade. I heard Jennifer saying that contracts were poorly drafted. I heard Robert admitting difficulties with international clauses. She organized the contract pages on the table. And for 2 years, I sat there, organizing papers, knowing I could solve all these problems in a few hours. Why didn't you ever offer? Robert asked. Because no one asked. And because I had already learned that competence without social recognition is irrelevant in the corporate world. Richard got up and started walking again, processing everything he had discovered. So you really can analyze this contract? I can analyze, identify all problems, suggest specific corrections, and still draft the necessary addendums for simultaneous compliance with American and German legislation. Jennifer asked, in 2 hours? In an hour and a half. The remaining time is for you to review and approve the changes. Richard stopped walking. And the corrections you've already identified are precise and can be implemented immediately, but there are more problems beyond the 3 Klaus mentioned. More problems. Richard felt his stomach sink. 5 additional problems that can generate future complications. Tax issues, delivery deadlines incompatible with German holidays, inadequate warranty clauses for high-technology equipment. Robert whispered, 8 problems total? 8 problems that, if not corrected, can cost between 300,000 and 2 million euros in future losses. Richard looked at her with a mixture of admiration and terror. For 2 years, he had treated this woman like a disposable employee, and now he discovered she was possibly the most qualified person who had ever worked in his company. Sarah, he said, and for the first time in 2 years used a genuinely respectful tone. Can you save this contract? I can save this contract and still structure an internal legal department that prevents these problems in the future. Richard looked at the clock. 1:15 p.m. There was still an hour and 45 minutes before the final deadline. "Then do it," he said. "Please." Sarah got up and walked to the reception desk where she had always worked. She took a pen and began making precise notes in the contract margins. This time, not as the invisible receptionist trying to prove something impossible, but as Dr. Sarah Martinez, foreign trade specialist, doing exactly the work she had prepared for during years. "You'll need a computer," she said, without looking up from the document. "I'm going to draft the contractual addendums in English and German." Richard ran to get his laptop. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah was being seen for what she really was. Sarah worked in absolute silence for 40 minutes. It wasn't the careful organization of reception anymore, but the surgical precision of an experienced legal mind dissecting every aspect of the international contract. She made detailed notes, underlined specific clauses, scribbled calculations in the margins, and occasionally typed quickly on the laptop. The executives watched her like someone watching a maestro conducting a symphony. "Done," she said finally, organizing a pile of documents on the table. "Done?" Richard checked the clock. "It's only been 42 minutes. 42 minutes for complete analysis, identification of 8 contractual problems, and elaboration of 5 corrective addendums." Robert approached. "8 problems? You said you had found more?" "Exactly. Besides the 3 Klaus mentioned, I identified 5 additional problems that would go unnoticed until they caused real damage." Sarah pointed to her organized notes. "Problem number 4, currency clause. The contract fixes the euro at $1.10, but doesn't provide currency protection. With current volatility, you could have a loss of up to $200,000. Jennifer took a calculator. "How so?" "If the euro rises to 1.18 during contract execution, which is likely, you'll pay $400,000 more without receiving anything in return." Michael whistled softly. "And the solution?" "Addendum establishing currency band. Variations above 5% activate automatic price revision clause." Sarah turned to the next page of notes. Problem number 5, delivery schedule. The second delivery is scheduled for June 15th, but there's a conflict with the German Corpus Christi in the previous week. Production automatically delays 15 days. Richard frowned. "How do you know about German holidays?" "I worked 6 months in Hamburg, remember? I know the German industrial calendar by heart." Robert was impressed. "And this affects what?" 15-day delay in the second delivery means delay in installation, which delays production start, which can cost up to $500,000 in lost revenue. Solution: reschedule the second delivery to late May or early July with automatic compensation clause for unjustified delays. Sarah continued. Problem number 6, inadequate technical warranty. The contract provides for 2-year warranty, but equipment of this complexity requires differentiated warranty by component. Differentiated how? Jennifer asked. Electronic components, 3 years. Mechanical components, 5 years. Software perpetual updates. Natural wear parts, 6 months with facilitated replacement. Richard was speechless. How do you know this? Because I've drafted dozens of similar contracts. Each type of equipment has specific warranty needs. Problem number 7, Sarah pointed to a specific section. Insufficient training clause. It provides for 40 hours of training for equipment operation that requires a minimum of 120 hours for complete mastery. And the 8th problem? Absence of technological obsolescence clause. In 3 years, when equipment needs upgrade, you'll be hostage to the German supplier without contractual protection. Robert shook his head. 8 time bombs hidden in a contract. 8 problems that would cost between $1 and $3 million over the next 5 years, Sarah confirmed. Richard sat heavily. And you prepared solutions for all of them? I prepared 5 contractual addendums. Each addendum solves multiple problems simultaneously, keeping the agreement attractive to both parties. She organized the documents she had prepared. Addendum A, Incoterms and responsibilities corrections. Addendum B, payment terms adjustments and currency protection. Addendum C, force majeure clause revision. Addendum D, realistic delivery schedule. Addendum E, adequate warranties and technological protection. Jennifer leafed through the addendums. This is too professional for 40 minutes of work. It's professional because this is how international contracts should be drafted, with precision, predictability, and mutual protection of interests. Richard looked at Sarah as if seeing her for the first time in his life. "For 2 years," he murmured. "I had the best legal consultant in New York working at my reception." "And for 2 years," Sarah replied calmly, "I watched you pay fortunes to external firms to solve problems I could solve for free." Michael observed, "For free? As a company employee, any legal consultancy I offered would be included in my salary. You could have saved hundreds of thousands of dollars in external fees." The complete dimension of the waste began to become clear. Richard hadn't just underestimated an employee, he had completely ignored a valuable resource that was right in front of him. "Sarah," he said, and his voice trembled slightly, You just saved my company." "I haven't saved it yet. First, we need to present these corrections to Klaus and get approval from the German board. Do you know how to do this?" Sarah smiled, the confident smile of a professional at the peak of her competence. "Mr. Sterling, I spent 8 years doing exactly this. I'm going to call Klaus, explain each correction in English and basic German, and still negotiate better conditions than originally proposed." She looked at the clock. "And I'm going to do this in the next 15 minutes, ensuring that the German board approves the changes before 5 in the afternoon." Richard couldn't help but smile, with genuine admiration. "Then do it. And Sarah?" "Yes? After this call, we need to talk seriously about your position in this company." While Sarah organized the documents for the call with Klaus, Richard couldn't stop looking at her. For 2 years, he had seen only a polite and efficient receptionist. Now, he was discovering he had ignored one of the most competent professionals he had ever known. "Sarah," he said, interrupting her preparations, "I need to understand. How did you bear it? 2 years being treated like I treated you." Sarah paused her work. "Do you really want to know?" "I do." She put the papers on the table and leaned back in the chair. "In the first months, I woke up every morning fighting the urge to quit. Not because of the work. Reception is dignified and important work, but because of the invisibility." Jennifer, Robert, and Michael approached, forming a circle around her. "For 8 years as a lawyer, I was Dr. Sarah. Clients sought me to solve million-dollar crises. Colleagues asked my opinion on complex cases. I saved companies, protected assets, developed international strategies." "And suddenly," Robert began, "suddenly I was nobody. A voice that answered phones, a person who smiled politely, someone whose opinion about anything was completely irrelevant." Richard felt a pang of guilt. "Why didn't you look for other firms?" "I looked for a whole year." Sarah laughed without joy. "Do you know what the legal market is like for women who abandoned their careers? Especially when the reason was taking care of family." "How do you mean abandoned?" Michael asked. "That's how they see it. A 26-year-old lawyer who was out of the market for 8 months lost timing, no longer has active network, may have new family problems in the future." Jennifer shook her head. "That's pure prejudice. It's the reality of the American legal market. Men who take sabbaticals are visionaries. Women who pause to care for family are risk professionals. Sarah went back to handling the documents, but continued talking. After 50 straight no's, I started working in administrative functions, first as secretary in small firms, then as assistant, until I got here. "But why did you stay so long?" Jennifer asked. "Because I discovered something I didn't expect. Peace. 2 years without. Internal firm politics, without having to prove competence to partners who earn 5 times more doing less work. Without clients screaming on the phone at 2 in the morning. Richard blushed. "But didn't you feel waste?" "Every day. But I also felt gratitude. You were never truly cruel to me. Arrogant, yes, condescending, always, but never evil. Until today." The observation cut Richard like a sharp razor. "Besides," Sarah continued, "working invisible, I learned things I would never learn as a senior lawyer." "Like what?" Robert asked. "I learned real humility. For 8 years as a lawyer, I thought I understood the reality of the corporate world, but I only knew the top of the pyramid." She organized a few more papers before continuing. "Working at reception, I saw how employees at all levels are treated. I saw the difference between politeness and respect. I saw how competence is devalued when it doesn't come with status." Richard swallowed hard. "Did you learn anything else?" "I learned that personal worth doesn't depend on external recognition. For 2 years, I continued being the same competent lawyer, even while cleaning coffee makers and organizing schedules." Jennifer asked, "And when your mother, when she passed, didn't you think about returning to law?" Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she controlled them quickly. "I thought about it, but I discovered I no longer missed the constant pressure, the need to prove, incompetence every day, the meetings that could be emails, the emails that could be 30-second conversations." "But didn't you miss the importance?" Michael asked. "Michael, what's the real importance of drafting contracts that only benefit one party, of creating clauses that exploit legal loopholes, of helping companies avoid social responsibilities?" The question hung in the air, uncomfortable and pertinent. "Working here, I helped people who really needed help, lost visitors, suppliers with questions, worried clients. It was small impact but real." Richard reflected. "So why did you accept the challenge today?" "Because it was time to stop hiding. And because," she smiled, "because it was obvious you were going to need help." Robert laughed. "Did you know it was a contractual trap?" "I knew the moment Klaus called. I recognized the pattern in his voice, the way he mentioned the problems. It was clearly a contract poorly drafted by haste or inexperience. And you let us panic like that anyway?" "I let you discover alone that you needed help. Sometimes you need to hit rock bottom to recognize you need a ladder." Richard looked at her with a mixture of admiration and embarrassment. "Sarah, I behaved like a complete idiot. You behaved like most American executives behave. The problem isn't personal, Richard. It's cultural." She finished organizing the documents. "You were raised in a society that teaches measuring worth by appearances. Diploma on the wall, position on the org chart, car in the garage. It's hard to recognize competence when it doesn't come with expected symbols." Jennifer observed, "But today you proved your worth incontestably. Today I stopped pretending to be less than I am, and you were forced to see beyond your own perception limitations." Richard asked, "And now? What happens after this call?" Sarah looked directly at him. "Now you have a choice. You can continue paying expensive external consultancies to solve problems I can solve internally, or you can recognize that the most qualified person to structure the company's legal department was sitting at reception for 2 years." She got up and walked to the phone. "But first, let's save these €2 million." Richard watched as she dialed the international number, preparing to conduct a negotiation that could define the company's future. For the first time in 2 years, Sarah wasn't being underestimated. And for the first time in his life, Richard was about to discover what it meant to have a true specialist working for him. Klaus, this is Sarah Martinez, legal consultant at Sterling International Trading. Sarah's voice sounded completely different on the phone. Professional, confident, authoritative, Richard almost fell off his chair. In 2 years, he had never heard Sarah speak with such security and command. "Hello, Ms. Martinez. Richard told me you would call. Your German is excellent. Where did you study?" "University of Hamburg during my specialization in European commercial law," Sarah replied fluently. "I analyzed your contract completely and identified all the clause problems." Klaus seemed impressed. "All of them? Including the ones we didn't mention?" "Actually, there are 8 problems total, not just 3. I prepared complete addendums that will protect both parties while maintaining agreement profitability." Richard followed the conversation with his mouth open. The woman conducting that international negotiation had nothing of the shy receptionist he knew. "Very interesting. Please explain the additional problems." First additional problem, currency protection. Your contract fixes the euro at $1.10 without protection clause. Current volatility can cost up to 200,000 euros for either party. Ach so, we didn't consider the dollar's volatility. What's your solution? Automatic price revision clause activated by currency variations above 5%. Both parties share the risk proportionally. Klaus was silent for a few seconds. That's really brilliant. What else? Second additional problem. Delivery schedule conflicts with German industrial calendar. Second delivery on June 15th conflicts with the Corpus Christi holiday week. Mein Gott, you're absolutely right. How did you know our production calendar? I worked 6 months in Hamburg studying German industrial regulations. I suggest rescheduling to May 30th or July 5th with automatic compensation clauses. Robert whispered to Richard, "She's destroying them with pure competence." Sarah continued methodically. Third additional problem, inadequate technical warranty structure. Complex industrial equipment requires differentiated warranty by component type. Please explain. Electronic components, 3 years. Mechanical parts, 5 years. Software, perpetual updates. Natural wear parts, 6 months with facilitated replacement. Klaus laughed on the other end of the line. "Ms. Martinez, you know more about our equipment than some of our own engineers. I drafted dozens of similar contracts. Each equipment type has specific warranty requirements for optimized protection." Richard looked at Jennifer, who was typing furiously on the laptop, trying to follow the negotiation's complexity. "And about the training clause?" Klaus asked. "Insufficient. 40 hours for equipment requiring minimum 120 hours for complete mastery. I suggest 120 hours divided into 3 phases: basic operation, advanced functions, and maintenance protocols." Excellent. And the final additional problem? Protection against technological obsolescence. In 3 years, when equipment needs upgrade, the buyer becomes completely dependent on the supplier without contractual protection. Klaus was silent for almost a minute. "Ms. Martinez, in 20 years negotiating international contracts, I've never had someone proactively identify this problem. It's a common flaw that becomes expensive later. I suggest technological upgrade clause with predetermined prices and guaranteed compatibility. Do your addendums protect both parties fairly?" "Absolutely. Bergman maintains profitability while Sterling receives adequate protection. It's a sustainable long-term partnership structure." Richard listened to the conversation like someone watching a science fiction movie. The woman on the phone was an international negotiator of the highest level. "Klaus," Sarah continued, "I'm sending the 5 amended contracts now. Each addendum solves multiple problems while maintaining commercial attractiveness. How long for our legal team to review?" "The addendums are self-explanatory and legally solid in both German and American law. Your team should approve within 2 hours. And if we approve everything, then you'll have the most comprehensive and fair international supply contract your company has ever signed with an American partner." Klaus laughed. "Ms. Martinez, would you consider working directly with Bergman Industries? We could use someone with your expertise in our South American operations." Richard felt his stomach turn. Was Klaus trying to steal Sarah? "I appreciate the offer, Klaus, but I'm committed to developing Sterling International Trading's legal department. We're building something special here." "I understand. Well, if you ever change your mind, but for now, I'll recommend immediate approval of your addendums to our board. Thank you very much, Klaus. I'll send everything in 15 minutes. Auf Wiedersehen, Ms. Martinez. It was a pleasure working with a true professional." When Sarah hung up, the silence in the office was absolute. Richard was the first to speak. "In 15 minutes of calling, you did more for the company than I did in the last 6 months. I did my job, the job I trained and specialized for," Jennifer observed. "Sarah, you just conducted one of the most impressive negotiations I've ever witnessed. And saved €2 million in the process," Robert added. Sarah returned to the computer to finalize the documents. "Now I'll send the addendums and await German approval. We should have confirmation in 2 hours." Richard watched her work and realized he had just witnessed the birth of something extraordinary. His receptionist had just transformed into the most competent legal director he could ever hire. 2 hours later, the phone rang with Klaus's confirmation. All addendums had been approved by the German board. The €2 million contract was saved, restructured, and protected against future problems. Richard was euphoric. Jennifer and Robert were celebrating openly. Michael was already calculating the positive impact on annual revenue. "Sarah, you saved the company!" Richard exclaimed. "You're incredible! You're—" The reception phone rang, interrupting the celebration. Sarah answered professionally. "Sterling International Trading, good afternoon." The voice on the other end made her face immediately pale. "Sarah? Sarah Martinez Delgado? This is Dr. Henry Morrison from Morrison, Martinez and Associates law firm." Richard saw the transformation in Sarah's face and signaled for everyone to be quiet. "Dr. Henry," Sarah replied with a controlled but tense voice. "Sarah, very troubling information has come to my attention. I heard you're practicing law without license at Sterling International Trading." The silence in the office became mortal. "How do you mean without license?" Richard whispered. Dr. Henry continued with a cold and threatening voice. "Sarah, you forgot that you were removed from the New York Bar Association 2 years ago for client abandonment?" Richard felt the world collapse again. "Removed from the Bar Association?" Jennifer whispered, horrified. "Dr. Henry," Sarah said, trying to maintain composure, "I provided technical consulting, not practiced law." "Technical consulting?" He laughed sarcastically. "Sarah, I have recordings of your call with Bergman Industries. You conducted an international legal negotiation, drafted contractual addendums, offered specialized legal interpretation." "How do you have recordings?" Sarah asked, although she already knew the answer. "Bergman Industries has been our client for 15 years, Sarah. When Klaus mentioned that a Brazilian lawyer had conducted a brilliant negotiation, we naturally got in touch." Richard felt betrayed again, but this time for a different reason. "And now?" he asked with a hoarse voice. "Now, Mr. Richard Sterling, you have a serious problem. Allowing illegal practice of law is a crime, and any contract negotiated by an unlicensed person can be nullified. The bomb had exploded. In minutes, Sarah's victory had transformed into a legal catastrophe. Furthermore, Dr. Henry continued, Bergman can claim bad faith and cancel the entire contract. They were induced to believe they were negotiating with a licensed attorney. Robert whispered, "Can this invalidate everything?" "Completely," Dr. Henry confirmed, as if he had heard. "And there are still criminal issues, illegal practice of profession, fraud, false identity." Richard looked at Sarah, who was pale but standing. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "Because I didn't and practice law," she replied firmly. "I provided technical consulting based on my personal knowledge." "Sarah," Dr. Henry laughed, "you conducted an international negotiation on behalf of a client, drafted legal documents, offered specialized legal interpretation. If that's not law practice, what is?" Richard ran his hands through his hair. "And why were you removed from the Bar Association?" The question Sarah feared had finally come. "When my mother got sick, I started missing hearings to accompany treatment. I missed some important deadlines. Clients were harmed." "Some deadlines," Dr. Henry corrected. "Sarah abandoned 3 important cases, causing damages of more than $500,000 to our clients." "I was taking care of my mother with cancer," Sarah exploded, "and that's why you were properly sued at the Bar Association for client abandonment and inadequate conduct." Jennifer asked, "And didn't she defend herself?" "How?" Sarah replied, with tears in her eyes. "I was caring for a terminal mother, without money to hire a lawyer, trying to work to pay medical bills." "Did the Bar Association remove you without hearing your defense?" Michael asked, indignant. "They accepted the version of Morrison, Martinez firm, one of the most influential in New York, against the word of an isolated lawyer with personal problems." Dr. Henry intervened. "The decision was technical and fair. Client abandonment is serious misconduct, regardless of personal reasons." Richard looked at the phone, then at Sarah, then at the contract she had saved. "Dr. Henry, what do you want?" "I want Sarah to immediately stop any activity that could be confused with law practice. And I want you to hire our firm to regularize this entire situation." "Hire you?" "Naturally, you'll need licensed attorneys to renegotiate the contract with Bergman, explain the situation, and avoid major legal complications." Richard realized the trap. Dr. Henry had sabotaged Sarah precisely to get a new client. "And if I don't hire you, then I can't guarantee that Bergman won't discover by other means that they were deceived by an unlicensed lawyer." It was pure and simple blackmail. Richard looked at Sarah, who remained standing, dignified even in defeat. "Sarah, did you lie to me?" "I didn't lie. I said I had legal training, contract experience, capacity to solve the problem. All of that is true. But you can't practice law." "I know, I can't. But when you made that humiliating bet, when you publicly challenged me, She stopped. Jennifer completed. "You wanted to prove your worth. I wanted to prove that competence doesn't depend on licenses or approval seals." Richard found himself in an impossible situation. Sarah had saved €2 million, but using knowledge she legally couldn't apply professionally. "And now?" he asked, desperate. Dr. Henry answered through the phone. "Now, you hire qualified professionals to solve the mess you created." Richard looked at Sarah one last time. "I'm sorry," he said, "but I can't risk the company." "I understand," she replied with intact dignity. "You're fired." The words came out harsher than he intended, but there was no alternative. Sarah nodded silently, took her purse and headed for the door. "Sarah," Richard called her. "Yes? You saved my company. I'll never forget that." "Neither will I," she replied, and left. Richard stood looking at the door, through which she had exited, knowing he had just made the biggest mistake of his business life. 3 days passed. Richard hired the Morrison, Martinez and Associates firm for $15,000 to regularize the situation with Bergman Industries. Dr. Henry called Klaus, explaining there had been a misunderstanding about the negotiator's qualification. Klaus's reaction was unexpected. "Dr. Henry, let me understand. You're saying that the most competent woman in international contracts I've ever met in America doesn't have a license to practice law?" "Exactly. She was removed from the Bar Association for inadequate conduct." "And what was this inadequate conduct?" "Client abandonment to care for family issues." There was a long pause on the line. "Dr. Henry, in Germany, caring for family is considered a fundamental value, not inadequate conduct. But in America you waste talents through bureaucracy. This woman saved a €2 million contract in 40 minutes. Your licensed lawyers would take weeks and cost a fortune." Dr. Henry tried to regain control. "Klaus, we need to renegotiate the entire contract with our qualified team." "No." "What no?" "Dr. Henry, Bergman Industries won't renegotiate anything. The contract drafted by Ms. Martinez is perfect. We won't change a comma." "But she doesn't have qualification." "She has competence, which is more important than any paper." Richard listened to the conversation on speakerphone, along with Jennifer and Robert. Klaus continued, "And one more thing, Dr. Henry. Bergman will no longer work with your firm." "Why?" "Because you sabotaged the most competent professional we know in America for petty commercial interests." "Klaus, this isn't..." "It's exactly that. You destroyed the career of a woman who chose to care for her sick mother and now want to profit from the problem you created." The call was disconnected. Richard looked at his directors. "And now," Robert sighed, "Richard, we made the biggest mistake of our lives. Firing Sarah. Firing the most competent person who ever worked at this company." Jennifer agreed. "Richard, she saved €2 million and revolutionized our way of making international contracts. But she can't practice law. She can practice consulting," Michael observed. Klaus made that clear. Competence is worth more than bureaucracy. Richard remained silent, processing everything. The phone rang again. This time it was Klaus calling directly. "Richard, I need to talk to you." "Hi, Klaus. Where is Ms. Martinez?" She doesn't work here anymore." "You fired her?" Richard hesitated. The situation got complicated. "Richard, you're an idiot." The brutal frankness caught Richard by surprise. "How so?" "You had the most competent legal consultant in South America working at your reception and fired her because of American bureaucracy." "Klaus, she can't..." "Richard, listen to me carefully. Bergman Industries will offer Ms. Martinez an international consulting contract, €40,000 annually, plus profit sharing." Richard felt his stomach turn. "You're going to hire her?" "We are. And we're also going to recommend her to all German companies operating in America." "Why?" "Because competence is rare. And when you find it, you protect it, not destroy it." Richard looked out the window, seeing Sarah arriving at the building. She was coming to get her personal belongings. "Klaus, can I call you back?" "Sure, but Richard, don't let her leave the country. America needs professionals like her." Richard hung up and ran to reception. Sarah was organizing her things in a cardboard box. "Sarah!" "Hi, Richard. I just came to get my things." "Sarah, we need to talk." "There's nothing to talk about. I understand your position." "No, you don't understand." Richard took a deep breath. Klaus called. "Bergman wants to hire you as international consultant." Sarah stopped packing the box. "How so?" €40,000 annually, consulting for German companies in America." "And you're telling me this why?" Richard approached her. "Because I want to make a counteroffer." "Richard, Sarah, I want you to be my partner. The silence was absolute. Partner. 20% of the company, $15,000 salary, profit sharing, and complete freedom to structure our legal department. Sarah looked at him. Why? Because for 2 years I had the most competent professional in America working at reception, and I was too stupid to recognize it. And the Bar Association issue? You'll work as business consultant, not as lawyer. It's completely legal and much more profitable. Jennifer approached. Sarah, accept it. We need you. Robert agreed. You revolutionized the company in 2 days. Imagine what you can do in 2 years. Sarah looked around, the office where she had been, humiliated, where she had proved her worth, where she had discovered that competence is worth more than prejudice. There's one condition, she said. What? We're going to create an underutilized talent utilization program. How many competent people are working in functions below their capacity? Richard smiled. I accept. And we're going to establish a policy of unconditional respect for all employees, regardless of function. I accept that too. Sarah extended her hand. Then we have a deal. Richard shook her hand. Welcome back, partner. 1 year later, the sign on the door read, Sterling and Martinez, International Consulting. Sarah was in her partner office reviewing contracts from German, Japanese, and Chinese clients. The company had grown 300% in 1 year. The legal department she created was a market reference. They had discovered and promoted dozens of underutilized employees in various companies. Richard knocked on the door. Sarah, another proposal from Germany arrived. How many millions this time? 5, and they specifically asked for you to conduct the negotiation. Sarah smiled, taking the document. Richard, can I ask you a question? Sure. Do you regret making that cruel bet? Richard thought for a moment. No, because it took reaching that point of desperation for me to finally see who you really were. And what did I learn? That a person's worth is never in the function they perform, but in the competence they possess. Sarah returned to the contract, and that sometimes, she added, the most valuable people are right in front of us. We just need to learn to see. Richard nodded and left, leaving his partner, the former receptionist who saved his company, do what she did best, transform impossible contracts into extraordinary opportunities. On the desk, next to the computer, a small sign, competence doesn't need a license to exist. It just needs an opportunity to shine.